Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we are going to talk about Rasputin, a man whose name has echoed through more than a century of history, carrying with it the weight of mystery, devotion, and the twilight of an empire. As you settle into this moment, allow yourself to relax, to let the tensions of the day slip away, like snowflakes melting on warm glass. Close your eyes if you wish, or simply let your gaze soften as we journey together into the past, into the vast and frozen landscape of imperial Russia, where the story of Grigori Rasputin begins not with thunder or fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of a winter morning in a Siberian village so small that the whole world might have passed it by without a second glance. Imagine, if you will, the Russia of the late 19th century, a land so immense that it seemed to stretch beyond the edges of imagination itself. From the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, where crystal chandeliers cast their golden light across ballrooms filled with the rustle of silk and the murmur of French conversation, all the way across thousands upon thousands of miles of forest and steppe and frozen rivers to the distant corners of Siberia, where wooden houses huddled together against the cold, and the wind sang ancient songs through the branches of birch trees. This was a country of profound contrasts, where the lives of peasants unfolded in rhythms unchanged for centuries, marked by the seasons and the soil, and the endless cycle of planting and harvest. While in the great cities, the modern age pressed forward with its railways and its telegraphs and its restless questioning of old certainties. In this vast empire, ruled by the Romanov dynasty with its double-headed eagle looking both east and west, there existed a deep current of spirituality that ran through the hearts of its people, like an underground river. The Russian Orthodox Church, with its golden domes reaching toward heaven and its icons painted in colors that seemed to glow with an inner light, was not merely an institution, but the very soul of the nation. In village churches throughout the land, candles flickered before the faces of saints, and the liturgy was chanted in Old Church Slavonic, the words flowing like honey, like water, like something that connected the present moment to all the moments that had come before. But alongside this formal religion, there existed something older, something that predated the organized church, a folk mysticism woven from ancient Slavic traditions, from beliefs in the healing power of the earth and the wisdom of wanderers who had renounced worldly possessions to seek divine truth along the roads and paths of holy Russia. It is into this world, into this particular moment, when the old ways still held their power, but the future was already pressing at the edges of consciousness like the first light of dawn, that our story truly begins. The year was 1870, and in the village of Pokrovskoye, situated in the Tyumen Oblast of western Siberia, along the banks of the Tura River, a child was born to a family of peasants. The village itself was a small collection of wooden houses and buildings, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the sun and the seasons and the demands of the land. The houses were built in the traditional style, with logs fitted together and chinked with moss and clay, their roofs sloping steeply to shed the heavy snows that came each winter, covering everything in a blanket of white that muffled all sound and made the world feel both smaller and larger at the same time. The family into which this child was born bore the name Rasputin, and while later years would see all manner of speculation about this surname, in truth it was simply one of many names that existed in the vast catalogue of Russian peasant families. His father was Yefim Yakovlevich Rasputin, a man who worked the land and later served as a coachman, one of those sturdy, reliable figures who formed the backbone of village life. His mother was Anna Vassilievna, and though history has preserved less about her than about her son, we can imagine her as one of those women whose strength was quiet but absolute, who kept the household running through all the challenges that peasant life presented, who knew the old songs and the old prayers and passed them down as naturally as breathing. The child was given the name Grigori, and he came into a world that was both harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The winters in Siberia were long and severe, with temperatures that could plunge to depths that seemed to freeze the very air itself. But there was also a stark beauty to that landscape, a purity to the endless, snow-covered fields and the frost-covered trees that sparkled in the weak winter sunlight like nature's own cathedral. The summers, though brief, brought an explosion of life, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and the sun lingering in the sky until late into the evening, as if reluctant to leave this northern realm to the darkness. Young Grigori grew up in this environment, experiencing the rhythms of peasant childhood that had remained essentially unchanged for generations. He would have learned early the skills necessary for survival in this demanding land, how to tend animals and work in the fields, how to read the sky for signs of coming weather, how to find warmth and shelter when the cold pressed in with seemingly malevolent intent. The village of Pokrovskoye was small enough that every child knew every other child, every family knew the business of every other family, and the church stood at the center of communal life, both literally and figuratively, its bell calling the faithful to prayer and marking the passage of time through the days and weeks and years. But even in childhood, there were signs that Grigori was different from the other village children, though perhaps these signs were not as dramatic as later storytellers would claim. Some accounts suggest that he showed an early sensitivity to the suffering of others, a kind of empathy that went beyond the ordinary. Other stories speak of moments when he seemed to know things he could not have known through normal means, or possessed an intuitive understanding of the natural world that went beyond mere observation. Whether these tales are entirely accurate, or whether they have been colored by the knowledge of what he would later become, we cannot say with certainty. But it seems clear that even in those early years, there was something about Grigori Rasputin that set him apart, that marked him as someone who might travel a different path than most of his fellow villagers. As Grigori moved through his childhood and into his teenage years, he received the kind of education that was typical for a peasant child of that time and place, which is to say, very little formal schooling. He never truly learned to read and write with any fluency, and throughout his life his literacy remained limited, his written words showing the marks of someone who had acquired these skills late and imperfectly. But this lack of formal education didn't mean a lack of learning, for the oral tradition of Russian peasant culture was rich and deep, filled with stories and songs and proverbs that carried the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. He would have learned the prayers and rituals of the Orthodox faith, not from books, but from participation, from standing in the village church and hearing the liturgy chanted, from observing the gestures and genuflections and understanding them in his bones rather than through intellectual comprehension. The teenage years brought with them the usual turbulence of that time of life, the push and pull between childhood and adulthood, between the familiar patterns of village life and the yearning for something more, something different. Some accounts from this period suggest that young Grigori was not always the most well-behaved of youths, that he had a wild streak, that he sometimes drank too much and got into the kind of minor troubles that young men in small villages have gotten into since time immemorial. But other accounts paint him as someone already seeking something deeper, already sensing that there was a spiritual dimension to existence that called to him with an urgency that the ordinary pleasures and pursuits of village life could not satisfy. Then, at some point in his late teenage years or early 20s, something shifted in Grigori Rasputin's life, something that would set him on the path that would eventually carry him far from the banks of the Tura River and into the golden halls of imperial power. The exact nature of this shift has been told in many different ways, with varying degrees of drama and supernatural embellishment, but at its core seems to be a genuine spiritual awakening, a moment or series of moments when the young peasant felt called to seek a deeper understanding of divine truth, to pursue a path of religious devotion that went beyond the conventional observances of village Christianity. One version of this transformation speaks of a vision he experienced, perhaps in the village church, or perhaps out in the fields or forests that surrounded Pokrovskoye, a moment when he felt the presence of something holy and overwhelming, something that changed him from the inside out. Another version suggests that he was inspired by an encounter with a wandering holy man, one of those pilgrims who traveled the roads of Russia seeking divine wisdom and living on the charity of believers. These wanderers, known as straniki, were a recognized part of Russian spiritual life, men and women who had renounced worldly attachments and worldly comforts to pursue a direct experience of the divine, and they were often treated with a mixture of respect and awe by the peasant communities through which they passed. Whatever the precise catalyst, Grigori Rasputin in his early 20s began to change his life in fundamental ways. He started to spend long hours in prayer, to fast, and to practice the kind of self-denial that was associated with serious spiritual seeking in the Orthodox tradition. He began to speak of his desire to go on pilgrimage, to visit the holy places of Russia, and perhaps even to travel to Jerusalem itself, that most sacred of destinations for any Christian believer. This decision was not without its complications, for he had by this time married a local woman named Praskovia Fyodorovna Dubrovina, and they had begun to have children together, with a daughter named Maria being born in 1898, another daughter Varvara following later, and eventually a son named Dmitri who would not survive to adulthood. For a peasant man to leave his family to go wandering in search of spiritual enlightenment was not unheard of in Russia, but neither was it a simple or easy choice. It meant leaving his wife to manage the household and the children, to work the land, and to navigate the complexities of village life without his presence. But Praskovia seems to have been a woman of considerable strength and practical wisdom, and she apparently accepted, or at least accommodated, her husband's spiritual calling, perhaps recognizing that this was something he needed to do, perhaps believing in the genuine nature of his religious seeking, perhaps simply understanding that some forces in life cannot be resisted or redirected, but must be allowed to run their course. And so Grigori Rasputin became a pilgrim, a wanderer, joining that tradition of seekers who believed that spiritual truth could be found not in books or formal theological training, but in the act of walking, in the practice of moving through the landscape with prayer in the heart and openness to whatever divine wisdom might be revealed along the way. He began to travel, first to nearby monasteries and holy sites, then ranging farther afield, always on foot, sleeping in churches or monasteries when he could, accepting hospitality from believers who saw in him a genuine seeker, enduring hardship and discomfort as part of the spiritual discipline that would purify his soul and bring him closer to God. The life of a wandering pilgrim in Russia at the turn of the 20th century was not an easy one, but it had its own rhythms and rewards. The country was vast, and the network of monasteries, convents, and holy sites was extensive, creating a kind of alternative geography, a sacred landscape that overlay the physical one. A pilgrim could walk for weeks or months, moving from one holy place to another, participating in the liturgies and prayers of each location, absorbing the particular spiritual atmosphere of each monastery or shrine, meeting other pilgrims and holy men and women along the way, sharing stories and insights and the kind of wisdom that comes from direct experience rather than from books or formal instruction. Rasputin's wanderings took him to many of the great spiritual centers of Russia. He visited the ancient monasteries where monks had lived and prayed for centuries, where the icons seemed to glow with accumulated prayer, where the very stones of the buildings seemed soaked in holiness. He made pilgrimage to sites associated with particular saints or with miraculous events, places where believers came to seek healing or divine intervention, or simply to feel closer to the sacred. He walked through forests and across steppes, through small villages and past isolated hermitages, always moving, always seeking, his appearance gradually changing as he adopted more fully the look of a wandering holy man, his hair growing long, his beard becoming full and unkempt, his clothing simple and worn, his feet often bare or wrapped only in the most basic of coverings. During these years of wandering, which seem to have occupied much of his late 20s and 30s, Rasputin began to develop a reputation. He was not the only wanderer seeking spiritual truth on the roads of Russia, but there was something about him that caught people's attention, something in his eyes, or his bearing, or the intensity of his devotion that made him memorable. He began to be known as someone who had a special gift, a particular connection to the divine. People started to seek him out, to ask for his prayers or his blessing, to request that he intercede with God on their behalf for healing or guidance or relief from suffering. The nature of these gifts or abilities has been much debated over the years, with interpretations ranging from the cynically dismissive to the mystically credulous. Some have suggested that Rasputin was simply a clever manipulator who knew how to read people and tell them what they wanted to hear, who used tricks and psychological techniques to create the impression of supernatural abilities. Others have maintained that he possessed genuine spiritual gifts, that he was one of those rare individuals who truly could serve as a conduit for divine healing power, that his prayers and his touch carried with them something real and potent that cannot be fully explained by materialist philosophy or modern psychology. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in between these extremes, or perhaps exists in a space where such binary categories do not adequately capture the complexity of human experience. Rasputin clearly believed in his own connection to the divine, believed that he had been called to a special role as a healer and spiritual guide. He practiced what was known as the prayer of the heart, a contemplative tradition within Orthodox Christianity that emphasized the continuous repetition of the Jesus prayer. The simple phrase, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner," repeated over and over until it synchronized with the breath and the heartbeat, becoming less a conscious recitation and more a continuous state of prayer that permeated every moment of existence. This practice, when pursued with genuine devotion and intensity, could indeed produce altered states of consciousness, could create a sense of direct communion with the divine, could open the practitioner to experiences and perceptions that went beyond the ordinary. Whether we interpret these experiences in religious terms as direct contact with God, or in psychological terms as access to deeper levels of consciousness and the mobilization of the mind's latent capacities, the practical effect could be the same: the creation of a person who radiated a certain power, a certain presence, a certain ability to affect others in ways that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of human interaction. Rasputin's pilgrimage years also brought him into contact with various mystical traditions that existed somewhat at the margins of Orthodox Christianity. There were groups and movements that emphasized direct spiritual experience over formal theology, that practiced forms of devotion that church authorities sometimes viewed with suspicion or even condemned as heretical. One such group was the Klesti, a mystical sect that reportedly engaged in ecstatic worship involving prolonged singing and circular dancing that could lead to trance states, and which was also rumored, rightly or wrongly, to engage in practices that violated conventional moral standards, including sexual rituals that were supposedly justified by their belief that sin could be a path to spiritual purification, and that redemption was most meaningful when it followed from the deepest experiences of human frailty and transgression. Whether Rasputin actually had significant involvement with the Klesti, or whether this accusation was largely a slander spread by his enemies, has been the subject of considerable debate among historians. Some argue that the evidence for his connection to this sect is thin and unreliable, based mainly on the testimony of people who had reason to wish him ill. Others suggest that while he may not have been a formal member of such a group, he was certainly influenced by mystical currents that ran through Russian spirituality, currents that emphasized personal religious experience and questioned rigid moral boundaries in ways that made church authorities uncomfortable. What does seem clear is that Rasputin developed a spiritual philosophy that combined traditional Orthodox piety with elements that were more unconventional, perhaps even radical. He spoke of the importance of experiencing sin as a path to understanding redemption, of the need to descend into darkness in order to fully appreciate the light, of the idea that those who had never struggled with temptation could not truly understand the nature of divine mercy and forgiveness. These ideas, which had precedence in certain strands of Christian mysticism, could be interpreted in various ways, some more charitable than others, and they would later provide ammunition for those who wished to portray him as a false prophet, a corrupter, a man who used religious language to justify base appetites and immoral behavior. But for now, in these years of wandering and spiritual development, Rasputin was still relatively unknown beyond the circles of peasants and minor clergy and fellow seekers who encountered him on the roads and in the monasteries of provincial Russia. He was building a reputation, developing a following, but he remained a figure of the countryside, a man whose influence extended no further than the next village or the next monastery, whose name meant nothing in the great cities where power and wealth and culture concentrated themselves into increasingly dazzling displays of modernity and sophistication. That would begin to change as the new century dawned, as the Russian Empire moved into what would prove to be the final chapter of its long and complex history. Rasputin, now in his early 30s, had completed many pilgrimages, including, reportedly, a journey to Jerusalem, that most precious of destinations for any Christian pilgrim, where he would have walked the Via Dolorosa and prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and stood on ground made sacred by 2,000 years of devotion and longing. He had also made pilgrimage to Mount Athos in Greece, that monastic republic where men had devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation since the early days of Christianity, where the rhythm of life was dictated entirely by the liturgical calendar and the requirements of spiritual discipline, where the world of politics and commerce and ordinary human concern seemed very far away indeed. These experiences deepened Rasputin's sense of spiritual authority, his conviction that he had been called to a special purpose, and they also enhanced his reputation among those who heard of his journeys and his devotions. Word began to spread more widely about this Siberian peasant who had such remarkable spiritual intensity, who seemed to carry with him an aura of holiness mixed with something more mysterious and harder to define, something that both attracted and unsettled those who encountered him. He began to be invited to visit with clergy of higher rank, to stay at more prominent monasteries, to meet with people of greater educations and social standing, who were curious about this unconventional holy man. It was through these expanding networks of spiritual seekers and religious enthusiasts that Rasputin eventually came to the attention of people who moved in the highest circles of St. Petersburg society. The capital of the Russian Empire, built by Peter the Great on marshland at the edge of the Baltic Sea, was a city of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary contradictions. Its neoclassical palaces and Baroque churches, its wide boulevards and elegant bridges, its grand parks and glittering court life represented the westward-looking face of Russia, the attempt to create a modern European capital that could stand alongside Paris and Vienna and London as a center of culture and power and refined civilization. But beneath this polished surface, there ran deep currents of uncertainty and searching, a sense that despite all the outward grandeur, something essential was missing, some spiritual center that could provide meaning and purpose beyond the endless round of balls and receptions and formal ceremonies. Many members of the aristocracy and the educated classes, while outwardly conforming to the expected patterns of society, were privately drawn to various forms of mysticism and spirituality that promised a more direct and authentic connection to the divine than what they found in the formal observances of the state church. This spiritual searching was particularly pronounced among certain circles of women, aristocratic ladies who had the leisure and the education to explore questions of meaning and purpose, who felt constrained by the limited roles available to them in a society that was still fundamentally patriarchal, despite its veneer of European sophistication, and who found in mystical religion and unconventional spiritual teachers a realm where they could exercise a kind of agency and authority that was denied to them in other spheres of life. These women would become crucial to Rasputin's eventual rise to prominence, for they would serve as his advocates and supporters, his bridge into a world that would otherwise have remained forever closed to a barely literate Siberian peasant. Among the first of these high-born supporters were women like Militsa and Anastasia, Grand Duchesses by marriage, daughters of the King of Montenegro, who had married into the Romanov family and who maintained a salon where mysticism and the occult were discussed with an openness that would have been scandalous in more conservative circles. These women were fascinated by spiritualism, by fortune-telling, by any teaching or practice that promised access to hidden knowledge or supernatural power, and they were always on the lookout for new spiritual teachers and wonder-workers who might provide them with the authentic experience of the sacred that they craved. It was through connections like these that Rasputin, sometime around 1903 or 1904, found himself being invited to St. Petersburg, being asked to visit the homes of prominent aristocrats, being presented to people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages and whose opinions carried weight in the corridors of power. He would have arrived in the capital as a striking figure, this tall man with his long hair and his unkempt beard and his penetrating eyes, dressed in the simple rough clothing of a peasant, speaking with the accent of Siberia, bringing with him an air of the countryside and the monastery and the open road, a living embodiment of that authentic Russian spirituality that the aristocrats of St. Petersburg both romanticized and feared. His impact was immediate and divisive. Some who met him were repelled by his crude manners and his presumption, by the way he seemed to lack any proper sense of the social hierarchies that governed interactions between people of different classes, by his tendency to speak too directly, to stare too intently, to position himself as an equal or even a spiritual superior to people who outranked him by every conventional measure. But others, particularly those women who were seeking spiritual authenticity, found in him exactly what they had been looking for: a teacher who seemed to embody a direct connection to the divine, who could speak of spiritual matters with a conviction and an authority that came not from books or formal training, but from lived experience, from years of prayer and pilgrimage and inner struggle. Rasputin began to develop a following in St. Petersburg, a group of devoted supporters who defended him against his critics, who spread stories of his healing powers and his spiritual insights, who opened doors for him and introduced him to ever more prominent members of society. He would hold informal gatherings where he would speak about spiritual matters, offer prayers, provide counsel to those who sought his guidance. The content of his teaching was not particularly systematic or intellectually sophisticated, relying more on aphorisms and stories and intuitive insights than on theological argument. But for many who heard him, this very lack of intellectual pretension was part of his appeal, evidence that his wisdom came from a deeper and more authentic source than mere book learning could provide. His reputation as a healer was growing as well, with stories circulating about people who had been ill or troubled and who had experienced relief or recovery after receiving his prayers or his blessing. Some of these accounts may have been exaggerated or even invented, but others seem to have been based on genuine experiences where people felt that their suffering had been eased through their encounter with this unusual holy man. Whether the mechanism was faith healing, the placebo effect, psychological suggestion, or some combination of these factors, the practical result was the same. A growing number of people who believed that Rasputin possessed special powers and who were grateful for his intervention in their lives. It was this reputation as a healer that would eventually bring Rasputin to the attention of the most important family in all of Russia, the imperial family itself, the Romanovs, who had ruled the vast empire for 3 centuries and whose current head was Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar had ascended to the throne in 1894, following the death of his father, Alexander III, and he had inherited an empire that was straining under the weight of its own contradictions, where industrial modernization was creating new social classes and new sources of tension, where demands for political reform were growing louder, where the gap between the glittering life of the court and the grinding poverty of the masses was becoming harder to ignore or justify. Nicholas II was by temperament ill-suited to the challenges of his position, a man of personal charm and devotion to his family, but lacking the vision and the strength of will that the historical moment demanded. He was deeply conservative, committed to the principle of autocracy, the idea that the Tsar ruled by divine right and that any limitation on his power was both politically dangerous and spiritually wrong. He was also deeply devoted to his wife, the Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, and this devotion, while touching in its sincerity, would prove to be politically catastrophic, for Alexandra's influence on her husband would grow stronger over the years, and her judgment in political and personal matters was often disastrously poor. Alexandra was born as Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine, a German princess who had come to Russia to marry the young Tsarevich Nicholas, converting to Russian Orthodoxy and taking a new name as part of her adoption of her new homeland. She was beautiful and dignified, but also shy and reserved in public, more comfortable in the intimate circle of her family than in the glittering and gossipy world of the court. She took her new faith with great seriousness, embracing Russian Orthodoxy with the intensity of a convert, seeing in it not just a formal religion, but a complete world view, a way of understanding her role as empress as something sacred and divinely ordained. The marriage of Nicholas and Alexandra was genuinely loving, a true partnership based on deep affection and shared values, but it was overshadowed from the beginning by a growing anxiety about the succession to the throne. The couple had 4 daughters in succession: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, beautiful and charming girls who were raised with a combination of imperial privilege and relative simplicity. But under Russian law, a daughter could not inherit the throne. The empire needed a male heir, and with each daughter that was born, the pressure and the anxiety grew more intense, the sense that perhaps this was a sign of divine disfavor, that somehow the imperial couple was failing in their most fundamental duty. Then, in 1904, after 10 years of marriage, Alexandra finally gave birth to a son, Alexei, and the relief and joy throughout the empire was immense. The succession was secured, the dynasty would continue. The future seemed bright with promise. But this joy would prove to be short-lived, for it soon became apparent that something was wrong with the young Tsarevich, that he suffered from a condition that would cast a shadow over his entire life and would have profound consequences, not just for the imperial family, but for the fate of the entire Russian Empire. The condition was hemophilia, a genetic disorder affecting the blood's ability to clot, which meant that any injury, even a minor bruise or bump, could lead to internal bleeding that was difficult to control, and that caused excruciating pain. The disease had run through the royal families of Europe for generations, carried by female descendants of Queen Victoria of England, who did not themselves suffer from the disease, but who could pass it on to their sons. Alexandra was one of these carriers, and she had passed the condition on to her only son, a fact that filled her with a guilt and anguish that would never entirely leave her, a sense that she had failed in her most basic duty as a mother, that she had somehow damaged the precious heir who was supposed to secure the dynasty's future. Hemophilia in the early 20th century was an incurable and often fatal condition, and it had to be kept secret from the Russian public, who must not know that their future Tsar suffered from this weakness, this taint in the bloodline. The imperial family lived under a constant cloud of anxiety, knowing that at any moment the young Tsarevich might suffer an injury or an episode of bleeding that could threaten his life, watching him with a protective intensity that verged on smothering, trying to keep him safe while also trying to allow him to have some semblance of a normal childhood. The imperial doctors could offer little help beyond bed rest and cold compresses and the administration of pain medication, and their inability to truly address the problem left Alexandra feeling desperate and helpless, willing to try anything that might ease her son's suffering or prevent the next crisis. It was this desperation, this willingness to reach beyond conventional medicine and conventional religion for any source of help, that would eventually bring Rasputin into the heart of the imperial family, into a position of influence and intimacy that would have seemed impossible for a peasant from Siberia, and that would ultimately contribute to the destruction of the very dynasty he claimed to serve. The exact date and circumstances of Rasputin's first meeting with the imperial family are somewhat unclear, with different sources providing different details, but it seems to have occurred around 1905 or 1906, when he was introduced to the Tsar and Tsarina through the networks of aristocratic supporters that he had cultivated in St. Petersburg. The initial meeting seems to have gone well, with the imperial couple finding something appealing in this unconventional holy man, something that spoke to their own spiritual yearnings and their hope that there might be forces beyond the material world that could help them with their suffering. But the real cementing of Rasputin's position came later, during one of the crises that periodically afflicted the young Tsarevich Alexei, when the boy was suffering from an episode of bleeding that the doctors seemed powerless to stop, when the pain was so intense that his screams echoed through the palace, when it seemed possible that this time the heir to the throne might actually die. In this moment of extremity, with conventional medicine offering no relief, Alexandra turned to Rasputin, summoning him to the palace, or perhaps contacting him by telegram, asking for his prayers, his intercession, his help. What happened next has been told and retold so many times that it is difficult to separate fact from legend. But the essence of the story is that Rasputin's intervention coincided with an improvement in Alexei's condition, that after his prayers, or his visit, or his telegram, the bleeding stopped, or the pain eased, or the crisis passed, and the boy began to recover. Whether this was coincidence, whether the crisis would have resolved itself anyway, whether there was some psychological mechanism at work by which the child and mother's belief in Rasputin's power actually triggered physiological changes that aided recovery, or whether there was something genuinely miraculous in Rasputin's prayers, we cannot say with certainty. But the effect on Alexandra was profound and lasting, creating in her a conviction that this man had been sent by God to save her son, that he possessed a special power that could keep Alexei alive, that he was therefore indispensable to the family and must be protected and supported, no matter what accusations might be leveled against him. From this point forward, roughly from 1907 or 1908 onward, Rasputin became a fixture in the life of the imperial family, particularly in Alexandra's life. He was given permission to visit the palace, to meet with the empress, and sometimes with the Tsar, to see the children, to offer his prayers and his counsel. He became what the family called our friend, a figure who stood outside the formal hierarchies of court and government, but who had the empress's ear and therefore possessed a kind of power that could not be easily categorized or controlled. For Rasputin himself, this transformation in his circumstances must have been extraordinary, almost beyond comprehension. The peasant from Pokrovskoye, the wandering pilgrim who had lived on charity and slept in churches, now found himself walking through the golden halls of the Winter Palace, speaking with the Tsar and Tsarina as something approaching an equal, his opinions sought on matters of state as well as matters of faith. He moved between two worlds, between the rough taverns and modest apartments where his common-born followers gathered, and the elegant drawing-rooms of the aristocracy, between the identity of a simple peasant holy man and the role of imperial confidant, and the tension between these worlds, the impossibility of truly belonging to either, would become one of the defining characteristics of his remaining years. In the court and in the fashionable salons of St. Petersburg, Rasputin was a figure of endless controversy and gossip. His critics, of whom there were many, and their number was growing, saw him as a charlatan and a manipulator, a crude peasant who had somehow hoodwinked the empress, who was using his position for personal gain and to satisfy base appetites. Stories circulated about his drunkenness, his womanizing, his crude language and behavior, his presumption in speaking to his betters as if he were their equal or superior. Some of these stories were undoubtedly true, or at least contained kernels of truth, for Rasputin never fully adopted the manners and conventions of polite society, never learned to moderate his speech or his behavior in the ways that were expected. He continued to drink, sometimes to excess, frequenting the restaurants and taverns of St. Petersburg, where he would hold court among a mixed crowd of admirers and hangers-on, speaking freely about all manner of subjects, sometimes making claims about his influence at court that were exaggerated or simply false. He was surrounded by women, many of them from aristocratic families, who were drawn to him for various reasons, some seeking spiritual guidance, others perhaps attracted by the aura of power and mystery that surrounded him, others possibly drawn by something more physical, by the intensity and charisma that many observers noted in his presence. The question of Rasputin's relations with women has been one of the most controversial aspects of his story, clouded by rumor and accusation and the difficulty of separating truth from slander. His enemies accused him of using his position as a spiritual counselor to seduce women, of engaging in sexual relationships with his female followers, of preaching a doctrine that sanctioned immorality in the name of spiritual development. Some of these accusations came from women themselves, though the reliability of these testimonies is questionable, as some may have been coerced or influenced by Rasputin's enemies, while others may have been motivated by their own complex feelings of attraction and revulsion, devotion, and betrayal. Rasputin's own teachings and behavior seem to have been genuinely ambiguous on questions of sexual morality. He spoke of the need to experience sin in order to achieve true repentance, of the danger of spiritual pride among those who had never struggled with temptation, of the greater mercy shown by God to those who fell and rose again than to those who never fell at all. These ideas could be interpreted as a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of moral development, or they could be seen as a convenient rationalization for self-indulgent behavior, and different observers drew different conclusions based on their prior attitudes toward Rasputin. What does seem clear is that he did not observe the conventional boundaries that normally existed between a spiritual teacher and his followers, particularly his female followers. He embraced people warmly, physically, in ways that seemed inappropriate to many observers. He made comments about women's bodies and beauty that struck many as crude and unseemly, coming from someone who claimed to be a holy man. He may well have engaged in sexual relationships with some of his followers, though the extent of this and the nature of these relationships remains unclear and contested. But to focus only on this aspect of Rasputin's life would be to miss the complexity of the man and the nature of his appeal to those who believed in him most fervently. For alongside the scandalous behavior and the crude manners, there was something else, something that his supporters insisted was genuine and powerful, a quality of spiritual intensity and emotional presence that could not be dismissed as mere charlatanism or manipulation. When he prayed, witnesses reported that he seemed to enter into a different state. his entire being focused with an intensity that was almost frightening. His eyes closed or fixed on an icon, his lips moving in the continuous recitation of prayer, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of devotion. When he spoke to someone who was suffering, he could display a quality of attention and compassion that made that person feel truly seen and heard, perhaps for the first time in their lives. This ability to connect with people on a deep emotional level, to make them feel that their pain mattered, that their spiritual struggles were understood, was particularly powerful in the context of early 20th century Russian high society, where so much of life was governed by rigid conventions and formal etiquette, where genuine emotional expression was often suppressed in favor of maintaining appearances, where people could feel profoundly isolated, even in the midst of glittering social gatherings. Rasputin offered something different, an encounter that felt authentic and unmediated, where the masks could drop and the soul could speak its truth. And for many who experienced this, particularly women who had few other outlets for genuine emotional and spiritual expression, the experience was transformative and created bonds of loyalty that could not be broken by scandal or accusation. The imperial family, particularly Alexandra, experienced this quality of Rasputin's presence in a heightened form, intensified by the desperate circumstances of their son's illness and their need to believe that someone, somewhere, possessed the power to help him. Rasputin became for Alexandra not just a healer, but a friend and spiritual advisor, someone she could speak to about her fears and hopes, someone who seemed to understand the terrible burden she carried, someone who never judged her for her foreign birth, or her reserved manner, or her anxious devotion to her son. He called the imperial couple by their first names, an informality that would have been unthinkable from anyone else, but that seemed to Alexandra like a sign of genuine spiritual intimacy, a relationship that transcended worldly hierarchies because it was founded on something higher and more sacred. Rasputin's influence on Alexandra's thinking extended beyond matters of faith and healing to encompass broader questions about the nature of Russia and the role of the autocracy. He reinforced her conviction that the Tsar ruled by divine right, that any compromise with demands for constitutional government or democratic reform was not just politically unwise, but spiritually wrong, a betrayal of the sacred trust that God had placed in the Romanov dynasty. He spoke of the deep faith and loyalty of the Russian peasantry, of their devotion to the Tsar as the little father who watched over them, and he encouraged Alexandra to believe that the discontent and revolutionary sentiment that was growing in the cities was the work of intellectuals and troublemakers who did not represent the true Russian people. These ideas aligned perfectly with Alexandra's own instincts and beliefs, and they had the effect of reinforcing the imperial couple's isolation from the reality of what was happening in their country, from the depth of the social and economic problems that were creating pressure for fundamental change, from the genuine grievances that drove people to support revolutionary movements or to demand a voice in their own governance. Rasputin became, in effect, an echo chamber for the Empress's worst impulses, confirming her in her conviction that holding firm to autocracy wasn't just politically necessary, but morally and spiritually required. As the first decade of the 20th century gave way to the second, the Russian Empire was entering a period of increasing instability and crisis. The disastrous war with Japan in 1904 and 1905 had exposed the weakness of the Russian military and had sparked revolutionary upheaval throughout the country, forcing Nicholas to agree to the creation of a parliament, the Duma, though he continued to resist any real limitation on his autocratic power. The brief period of optimism and reform that followed was giving way to renewed repression and a hardening of positions on all sides, with the government increasingly relying on the secret police and censorship to maintain control, while revolutionary groups were growing bolder and more willing to use violence to achieve their aims. In this tense atmosphere, Rasputin's presence at court became an increasingly prominent issue, with his critics arguing that he was a malign influence on the imperial family, that he was manipulating the empress for his own benefit, that his continued access to the palace was damaging the reputation of the monarchy and undermining whatever residual respect and loyalty the Russian people still felt for their Tsar. Newspapers began to publish articles attacking Rasputin, though they had to be careful about direct accusations given the censorship laws, so they often resorted to veiled language and innuendo that their readers would understand. Members of the extended Romanov family began to express concern about the situation, and even some of the Tsar's closest advisers tried to warn him about the dangers of allowing this unconventional and controversial figure to maintain such close ties to the imperial family. But Nicholas, and especially Alexandra, refused to distance themselves from Rasputin, and every attack on him only strengthened Alexandra's conviction that he was being persecuted by those who did not understand his true nature and his divine mission. She saw the attacks as evidence of a conspiracy against her family, proof that dark forces were at work trying to deprive her of the one person who could keep her son alive. This defensiveness, this absolute conviction that Rasputin was indispensable, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments of the entire imperial reign, creating a situation where the monarchy's credibility became tied to the reputation of a figure who was widely regarded as corrupt and dangerous. In 1911, the controversy around Rasputin reached a new intensity when religious authorities began to investigate his activities and his teachings, looking for evidence of heresy or immorality that could be used to discredit him officially. The Holy Synod, which governed the Russian Orthodox Church, conducted inquiries into his alleged connections with the Kallisti sect and into reports of his improper behavior with female followers. These investigations never resulted in formal charges, partly because of lack of conclusive evidence, partly because of Rasputin's protectors at court, but they added to the atmosphere of scandal and suspicion that surrounded him. During this period, Rasputin made another pilgrimage to Jerusalem, perhaps seeking to remove himself temporarily from the controversy, perhaps genuinely feeling a need to renew his spiritual connection to the holy places of Christianity. When he returned, the attacks continued, and in fact seemed to intensify, with even some of his former supporters beginning to distance themselves from him as the political costs of association became too high. But through it all, the Empress's faith in him remained unshaken, and as long as she supported him, he remained secure in his position, protected from consequences that would have destroyed anyone else. The years from 1911 to 1914 were a period when Rasputin's life settled into a kind of pattern, moving between his visits to the palace, his meetings with supporters and supplicants in his apartment in St. Petersburg, his occasional returns to his family in Siberia, and his continued wanderings to various holy sites and monasteries. He was a figure of enormous notoriety now, recognized in the streets, pointed out in restaurants, the subject of endless gossip and speculation. He seemed to revel in the attention, even as he complained about the attacks, enjoying the sense of being important, of being someone whose opinions mattered, of having transcended the limitations of his peasant birth to become a player in the great game of imperial politics. His relationship with money became another source of criticism during these years. Rasputin received gifts and payments from various sources, from grateful petitioners whose problems he had supposedly solved, from aristocratic supporters who wanted to ensure his continued goodwill, from people who hoped to use him as a conduit to the Empress, and through her to the Tsar. He was not poor anymore. This man who had once lived on charity and worn rough peasant clothes, and his critics saw in his willingness to accept money and gifts further evidence of his corruption, proof that he was motivated by greed and self-interest rather than genuine spiritual devotion. But Rasputin's own relationship to money seems to have been complicated, neither entirely selfless nor entirely mercenary. He did accept gifts and payments, but he also gave money away freely to those he judged to be in need, sending funds back to his family in Siberia, helping poor petitioners who came to him for assistance, supporting various charitable causes. He seemed to have retained something of the pilgrim's attitude toward material possessions, seeing them as useful but not ultimately important, certainly not worth hoarding or being too careful about, an attitude that could manifest as either generosity or carelessness, depending on the circumstances and the observer's perspective. In June of 1914, an event occurred that might have changed the course of Rasputin's story, and perhaps, therefore, the course of Russian history, if circumstances had been only slightly different. While visiting his home village of Pokrovskoye, Rasputin was attacked by a woman named Kionia Guseva, who approached him on the street and stabbed him in the abdomen with a knife, inflicting a serious wound that exposed his intestines and very nearly killed him. Guseva was associated with a defrocked monk named Iliodor, who had once been Rasputin's friend, but had turned against him and become one of his most bitter enemies, spreading stories about his immorality and his heretical teachings. Rasputin survived this attack, though it required surgery and a long period of recovery, and the fact that he lived through such a grievous wound was taken by his supporters as further evidence of his special status, of divine protection that watched over him and preserved him for his appointed purpose. But the wound never fully healed, and he suffered pain from it for the rest of his life, and some observers would later suggest that the attack and its aftermath affected his personality, making him more paranoid and more volatile, more prone to excess in his drinking and his behavior, as if the brush with death had loosened whatever restraints had previously moderated his conduct. The attack occurred in June of 1914, and the world's attention was about to be consumed by something far larger than the travails of one controversial holy man in Russia. Within weeks of Rasputin's stabbing, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo would set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the outbreak of the First World War. That great catastrophe that would destroy empires and redraw the map of Europe and claim millions of lives and fundamentally alter the course of human history. Russia would be drawn into this war, bound by treaty obligations and by considerations of prestige and strategic interest, and the war would prove to be the final crisis that the Romanov dynasty could not survive. As Rasputin lay recovering from his wound in a hospital in Siberia during those crucial summer weeks, the international crisis was escalating toward war, and Russia was being pulled toward the decision to mobilize its armies in support of its Serbian allies, a decision that would make general European war virtually inevitable. There are some historians who have speculated about what might have happened if Rasputin had been in St. Petersburg during those crucial days, whether his council might have pushed Nicholas toward a different decision, whether his peasants' instinct to avoid the disaster of war might have provided a counterweight to the voices urging mobilization. But this is speculation, imagining alternative histories that did not occur. Rasputin was not in St. Petersburg. He was recovering from nearly fatal wounds hundreds of miles away, and the decision for war was made without his input. Russia entered the First World War in August of 1914 with a wave of patriotic enthusiasm, with crowds gathering in the streets of St. Petersburg, which was immediately renamed Petrograd to sound less German, with even the Duma agreeing to suspend internal political conflicts for the duration of the war, with a general sense that the conflict would be brief and victorious, that Russian armies would march to triumph, and the war would serve to unite the nation and restore faith in the monarchy. Within months, these optimistic illusions would be shattered by the reality of modern industrial warfare, by catastrophic defeats on the battlefield, by casualty lists that mounted into the hundreds of thousands and then into the millions, by revelations of military incompetence and corruption, and shortages of weapons and ammunition that left soldiers going into battle inadequately equipped to face the German war machine. Rasputin returned to Petrograd after his recovery, and he was among the few voices who expressed skepticism about the war from the beginning, who warned that it would bring disaster to Russia, that the empire was not ready for this kind of conflict, that the cost in lives and suffering would be immense. Whether this skepticism came from genuine prescience or simply from a peasant's natural distrust of wars that would be fought primarily by other peasants, while the nobles and the wealthy remained safe, it would prove to be tragically accurate, and it would also add to the complications of his position, for his anti-war views made him suspect in the eyes of many who saw criticism of the war effort as unpatriotic or even treasonous. The Empress Alexandra, whose German birth had always been a source of some suspicion, was particularly vulnerable to accusations of divided loyalty as the war against Germany progressed. She was entirely devoted to Russia and to her adopted faith and to her husband's cause, but her difficulty with public communication and her reserved manner made it hard for her to convey this devotion to a skeptical public. Rasputin's continued presence at her side and his known opposition to the war fed into a growing narrative that there was a German party at court, that the Empress and her advisor were working to undermine the Russian war effort, that they were in communication with the enemy, and were perhaps even traitors to the Russian cause. These accusations were false and absurd, born of the paranoia and suspicion that wartime conditions always generate, but they were widely believed, repeated in salons and cafes, and in the corridors of government, undermining whatever remained of public confidence in the imperial family. The fact that Rasputin did sometimes advocate for peace, that he did try to influence Nicholas to seek a negotiated end to the war, was taken as evidence of his treachery rather than as a reasonable response to a catastrophic military situation that was only growing worse with each passing month. In September of 1915, Nicholas made the fateful decision to take personal command of the Russian armies at the front, leaving Petrograd to join the military headquarters at Mogilev. This decision was opposed by most of his advisers, who understood that it would mean that the Tsar would be held personally responsible for every subsequent military defeat. But Nicholas felt that it was his duty, that his presence would inspire the troops and demonstrate his commitment to the war effort. The practical effect of this decision was to leave Alexandra in effective control of the government in Petrograd, since Nicholas would be hundreds of miles away at military headquarters and would rely heavily on her reports and recommendations for managing civilian affairs. And Alexandra, in turn, relied heavily on Rasputin for advice and counsel, sharing with him reports about government ministers and policies, seeking his opinion on appointments and decisions, taking his recommendations with a seriousness that would have been shocking if it had been fully known to the public. Rasputin had no formal position in the government, no official authority of any kind, but through his influence on the Empress, he was able to shape decisions in ways that had real consequences for the conduct of the war and the governance of the empire. The system, if it could be called that, was chaotic and destructive. Ministers who displeased the Empress or whom Rasputin criticized would find themselves dismissed, regardless of their competence or the damage that their removal might cause to governmental stability. Men whom Rasputin supported, some of them capable enough, but others deeply corrupt or incompetent, would find themselves elevated to positions of great responsibility. The constant turnover in key government positions created a sense that no one was truly in charge, that there was no coherent policy or direction, that the machinery of government was breaking down even as the country faced the greatest crisis in its history. Rasputin's own role in all this is difficult to assess with precision, partly because the historical record is incomplete and biased, partly because his influence operated through informal channels that left few written traces, partly because his own motivations seem to have been mixed, and perhaps not entirely clear even to himself. Sometimes he seems to have genuinely tried to push for policies that he believed would help Russia or help the common people, arguing against the war, advocating for more attention to be paid to domestic problems, supporting some ministers who he thought were competent and honest. At other times, he seems to have been motivated by personal loyalty to those who showed him respect, or by resentment toward those who had attacked him, or by the simple enjoyment of power and the ability to make important people dance to his tune. His lifestyle during these war years became increasingly dissolute, or at least the evidence of his dissolute behavior became increasingly public and increasingly difficult for his supporters to ignore or explain away. He drank heavily in restaurants and nightclubs, making scenes that were witnessed by many people and that provided fodder for the gossips and the scandal sheets. He boasted about his influence at court, sometimes in crude and explicit terms, claiming that he could make or break ministers, that he had access to the most intimate secrets of the imperial family, that the empress would do anything he advised. Whether these boasts were accurate or exaggerated, whether he was genuinely revealing the extent of his power or simply engaging in drunken braggadocio, the effect was the same. A growing sense that the government of Russia during this time of crisis was being influenced by a peasant mystic with no qualifications and no understanding of statecraft, who was motivated by personal whims and base desires rather than by any coherent sense of the national interest. The damage to the monarchy's credibility was immense and possibly irreparable, as even people who had been traditionally loyal to the Tsar began to question whether he was capable of governing effectively, whether he was being manipulated by his wife, whether the entire system had become so corrupt and dysfunctional that nothing short of revolution could set things right. By 1916, the situation had become desperate. The war was going badly, with Russia having suffered catastrophic losses and having been forced to retreat from much of the territory it had initially occupied. The economy was straining under the burden of war production, with shortages of food and fuel beginning to affect even the cities, with inflation eroding the value of money, with peasants in the countryside starting to wonder why they should continue to supply grain to feed city dwellers and soldiers when they received so little in return. The Duma, that parliament which Nicholas had granted so reluctantly, and which he had repeatedly dismissed when it became too critical, was growing more vocal in its opposition to the way the war was being conducted and the way the government was being run. And increasingly, the focus of criticism from across the political spectrum was Rasputin himself, seen now as the symbol of everything that was wrong with the autocracy, the living embodiment of the corruption and incompetence and mystical obscurantism that was leading Russia toward disaster. Calls were made, sometimes in coded language, but increasingly explicitly, for Rasputin to be removed from influence, for the Empress to be isolated from decision-making, for the Tsar to take control of his own government and dismiss the camarilla of advisers and sycophants who were supposedly manipulating him and his wife. There were plots being hatched, conversations in darkened rooms and private clubs, discussions among people who felt that drastic action was necessary to save the monarchy from itself, that Rasputin had to be eliminated, not out of personal hatred, but as a matter of political necessity, to break his hold on the Empress and to demonstrate that Russia still had patriots who were willing to act decisively when the situation demanded it. These conversations included members of the aristocracy, politicians, military officers, and even members of the extended Romanov family. People who felt that the stakes were too high to worry about the niceties of legal process or the moral questions raised by political violence. The most serious of these plots was being developed by a group that included Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, and married to the Tsar's niece, Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar, who was a military officer and one of the bright young men of the imperial family, Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing politician and fervent monarchist who had become convinced that Rasputin was destroying the monarchy he loved, and a few others who were drawn into the conspiracy through their connections to these principles. They began to plan how they might lure Rasputin to a location where he could be dealt with quietly, how they might dispose of his body, how they might avoid immediate detection and buy time to consolidate their position before the authorities could react. The plan that eventually took shape was for Yusupov to invite Rasputin to his palace on the night of December 16th, 1916, using as bait the suggestion that Yusupov's wife, Princess Irina, would be present and could be introduced to Rasputin, though in fact she was not in Petrograd at the time. Rasputin apparently accepted the invitation, perhaps flattered by the attention of such an important aristocrat, perhaps curious about what might transpire, perhaps feeling secure in his position and unable to imagine that these men of such high social standing would actually mean him harm. What happened on that December night has been told many times, with various participants leaving accounts that differ in some details, but agree on the essential facts. Rasputin arrived at the Yusupov palace late in the evening and was brought down to a room in the basement that had been prepared for the occasion, decorated to seem welcoming and pleasant, with food and wine set out. Yusupov spent time with him there, talking, playing the guitar, while upstairs the other conspirators waited, and in the wine and the cakes that were offered to Rasputin there was poison, cyanide that the conspirators believed would be sufficient to kill him quickly and allow them to claim that he had died of natural causes or perhaps of excessive drinking. But the poison did not work, or did not work as quickly as they had expected, and Rasputin continued to talk and to eat and to drink, showing no immediate signs of distress, and the conspirators began to panic, wondering if their plan had failed, if somehow this man truly did possess supernatural protection that rendered him immune to poisons that would kill an ordinary person. Eventually, Yusupov, acting in growing desperation, produced a revolver and shot Rasputin, hitting him in the chest, and Rasputin fell, and the conspirators believed that the deed was done, that he was dead or dying, and that they needed now to dispose of the body and prepare their explanations for what had occurred. But then, in a moment that became part of the legend, and that terrified the conspirators, Rasputin stirred and rose, moving toward the door, trying to escape, and they shot him again, multiple times, until he finally fell and lay still. They beat him and wrapped his body in cloth and took it to a bridge over the Neva River, and they pushed it through a hole in the ice, letting the dark waters close over it, thinking perhaps that it would never be found, that it would disappear into the river, and their secret would be safe. But the body was found within a few days, pulled from the icy water, and when it was examined, there were reports, possibly exaggerated or even invented, that suggested he had still been alive when he entered the water, that he had died by drowning rather than from the bullets and the poison, that his lungs contained water and his arms showed signs that he had tried to free himself from the bonds that wrapped him. Whether these details are accurate, or whether they were embellishments added to the story later, they contributed to the image of Rasputin as a man who was extraordinarily difficult to kill, who clung to life with a tenacity that seemed to go beyond normal human endurance, who had to be shot and beaten and drowned before he would finally release his hold on the world. The news of Rasputin's disappearance, and then of the discovery of his body, spread quickly through Petrograd, and the reaction was mixed, with some celebrating the removal of what they saw as a malign influence on the government, while others mourned the loss of a holy man who had been murdered by aristocratic conspirators. The Empress was devastated, losing not just an advisor, but someone she had considered a true friend, someone she believed had been sent by God to protect her son. And she insisted on a funeral service for him, which was held privately at a location near the imperial palace, with only the imperial family and a few close associates in attendance. The conspirators were never formally punished for their role in the assassination, partly because of their high social standing, partly because many in the government and military secretly approved of what they had done, partly because within weeks the country would be consumed by events that made the fate of a few conspirators seem trivial in comparison. Prince Felix Yusupov was sent into internal exile on his estates. Grand Duke Dmitri was sent to serve with the army in Persia, removed from the capital, but not imprisoned or stripped of rank or title, and the others involved were dealt with even more leniently, if they were dealt with at all. The removal of Rasputin didn't save the monarchy, didn't prevent the catastrophe that was rushing toward the Russian Empire like an avalanche thundering down a mountainside. If anything, his martyrdom at the hands of aristocratic conspirators strengthened Alexandra's sense of isolation and persecution, hardened her conviction that dark forces were arrayed against her family, made her even more resistant to any suggestions that she should compromise or moderate her positions or distance herself from policies that were increasingly unpopular. And it removed from the scene, for whatever he had been worth, one of the few voices that had consistently argued against continuing the war. One of the few people who spoke to the imperial family in terms they could understand about the sufferings of ordinary Russians and the dangers of pushing the people beyond their endurance. Within weeks of Rasputin's death, the cold and the hunger that had been building in Petrograd reached a critical point, with bread lines growing longer, with factories running out of fuel, with anger and desperation building among the working-class neighborhoods. In late February of 1917, by the old Russian calendar, early March by the Western calendar, used in the rest of Europe, strikes and demonstrations began to spread through the capital, growing day by day. And when troops were ordered to suppress the protests, many refused or even joined the demonstrators, and it became clear that the government had lost control of the situation, that the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries was facing its final crisis. Nicholas, still at military headquarters, was persuaded to abdicate, to give up the throne that had been passed down through his family for so many generations, to try to save the institution of the monarchy, if not his own rule, by allowing his brother to succeed him, though his brother would decline the honor, understanding that the moment had passed, that monarchy itself had lost its legitimacy in the eyes of too many Russians. The imperial family was placed under house arrest, first at their palace at Tsarskoye Selo near Petrograd, later transferred to Tobolsk in Siberia, as the provisional government that had taken power tried to decide what to do with these relics of the old regime. And Alexandra, in her captivity, still mourned her friend, still believed that if only Rasputin had lived, if only his prayers and his counsel had been available, things might have turned out differently. The catastrophe might have been averted. She kept his letters and his icons, treasured the memories of his visits and his reassurances, could not or would not accept that his influence had been part of the problem rather than the solution, that the mystical faith she had placed in this peasant holy man had blinded her to the real forces that were tearing her world apart. The story would end in tragedy, as you perhaps know, with the imperial family being moved eventually to Ekaterinburg in the Urals, where in July of 1918, after the Bolsheviks had seized power and Russia had descended into civil war, they would be executed in the basement of the house where they were being held, shot and bayoneted until none remained alive, their bodies disposed of in a way that was meant to ensure they could never become relics or rallying points for monarchist resistance. But that is another story, one that extends beyond our focus tonight on the man who had been, for a few strange years, our friend to the imperial family, the peasant mystic who had walked through the golden halls of power and left behind him a trail of controversy and tragedy. Rasputin's body had been buried near the imperial palace after his funeral in December of 1916. But after the February Revolution, when the imperial family fell from power, it was exhumed by revolutionary soldiers and burned, the ashes scattered, as if to ensure that nothing remained of this man who had become such a powerful symbol of the old regime's corruption and superstition. The place in Pokrovskoye, where he had been born, had been rebuilt as a kind of monument to him by his supporters, but that too would be destroyed in the years that followed, the village returning to obscurity, the house where he had grown up eventually disappearing, as if it had never existed. His family survived him for a time. His wife Praskovia continued to live in Pokrovskoye, maintaining her dignity despite all that had happened, refusing to speak ill of the husband whose fame had brought such complications to her life. His daughters, Maria and Varvara, lived through the revolution and the civil war, eventually leaving Russia for exile in Europe and later in America, where they would try to make new lives, carrying with them the burden of their famous surname, sometimes embracing it by performing as Rasputin's daughters in circuses and exhibitions, sometimes trying to escape it by using other names and refusing to discuss their father. The legend of Rasputin, meanwhile, took on a life of its own, growing and mutating with each retelling, acquiring embellishments and distortions that made it increasingly difficult to separate the historical man from the mythical figure. He became, in the popular imagination, a kind of archetypal villain, the mad monk with hypnotic powers, the depraved mystic who had brought down an empire through his manipulation of a weak woman and a weaker ruler, a figure who embodied everything sinister and exotic about Russia in the eyes of Western audiences. Books and films and songs and plays featured him as a character, almost always in ways that exaggerated his powers and his wickedness, that made him more monster than man, that simplified the complicated reality of who he had been and what role he had actually played in the empire's final years. But if we step back from the legend and the propaganda, from the exaggerations of both his admirers and his enemies, what can we say about the real Grigori Rasputin, the man who was born in a Siberian village and died in the cold waters of the Neva River? He was, it seems, a person of genuine religious feeling, someone who truly believed in the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs, who had experienced something in his years of pilgrimage and prayer that convinced him he had been called to a special purpose. He was also a person of immense charisma and emotional intensity, capable of connecting with others in ways that could be profoundly moving, and that could create bonds of loyalty that survived scandal and opposition. He had a gift for reading people, for understanding what they needed to hear, what reassurances or challenges would most affect them. And he used this gift both in service of what he believed to be higher purposes and in service of his own ego and appetites. He was deeply flawed, capable of behavior that was crude and selfish and manipulative, unwilling or unable to moderate his appetites for drink and for the pleasures of the flesh, careless about the effects his actions had on others, including on the people who had placed their faith in him. He was also, in some ways, a victim of forces larger than himself, swept up in the collapse of an entire social and political order, made into a scapegoat for failures that had many causes and many people responsible for them, used by various factions to advance their own agendas in ways that had little to do with who he actually was or what he actually believed. He came from the people, from the peasant masses of Russia who formed the overwhelming majority of the empire's population, but who were largely invisible to the elites who governed them, who were seen as a kind of raw material to be mobilized for war or labor, but whose thoughts and feelings and spiritual lives were rarely taken seriously by those in power. Rasputin's rise to prominence was in some ways a disruption of that pattern, a peasant forcing his way into spaces where peasants did not belong, insisting on being heard and taken seriously by people who would normally never have given him a second glance. That this disruption ended badly, that it contributed to, rather than preventing, the disasters that engulfed Russia, should not obscure the fact that it represented something significant, a challenge to hierarchies that had seemed eternal and unchangeable, a reminder that spiritual authority and human worth cannot be measured solely by education or breeding or social position. The world that Rasputin inhabited, that Russia of the late empire, with its strange mixture of gilded luxury and grinding poverty, of mystical faith and modernizing ambition, of ancient traditions and revolutionary ferment, is gone now, swept away by the wars and revolutions of the 20th century, replaced by systems and societies that claim to be more rational, more scientific, more advanced. Whether they are actually better, whether they have solved the fundamental questions about meaning and purpose and the right ordering of human affairs that troubled the people of Rasputin's time, is a question that each observer must answer for themselves. But the story of Rasputin reminds us that human beings are not entirely rational creatures, that we are moved by forces that go deeper than logic or self-interest, that we hunger for meaning and connection and transcendence in ways that no amount of material progress can entirely satisfy. In the quiet moments of late night, when the world grows still and the usual distractions fall away, we might find ourselves thinking about the great mysteries that every human life must confront. Questions about the nature of faith and doubt, about the existence of powers beyond the material world, about the possibility of redemption and transformation, about what it means to live with integrity in a world that often seems to reward precisely the opposite. Rasputin's life, for all its flaws and failures and ultimate tragedy, was lived in engagement with these questions, not in the abstract realm of philosophy, but in the concrete reality of daily choices and encounters, in the effort to understand what it might mean to be a spiritual person in a world that is both sacred and profane, both beautiful and terrible. The snow falls softly on the banks of the Neva River, covering the streets of what was once St. Petersburg, then Petrograd, now St. Petersburg again, covering the ground where palaces once stood and where revolutionary crowds once surged, where a peasant mystic once walked through golden halls and where he was eventually cast into dark waters. The snow falls on the fields and forests of Siberia, on the village of Pokrovskoye, where a boy was born into a world that seemed eternal and unchanging, on the places where he prayed and wandered and sought the face of God in the landscape and in the faces of his fellow pilgrims. The snow falls and melts and falls again, covering and revealing, hiding and exposing, in the eternal cycle that knows nothing of human ambitions and human tragedies, that continues regardless of empires rising and falling, regardless of the small dramas of individual lives playing out their courses, and then fading into silence. As we come to the end of this long journey through one man's story, as the hours of the night have passed while we traveled together through time and across that vast landscape of imperial Russia, perhaps you feel yourself growing drowsy, your thoughts becoming softer and less distinct, the details of the story beginning to blend and blur at the edges like watercolors running together on wet paper. This is as it should be, this gentle descent into rest, this letting go of the day and its concerns, this trust in the darkness and the quiet that surrounds Yona. Rasputin's story is over, has been over for more than a century now. The man himself long since returned to the earth from which he came, his bones scattered and lost, his name preserved only in books and memories and the endless retellings that have turned history into legend. But the questions his life raised remain with us, questions about power and faith, about the relationship between the spiritual and the political, about what happens when people place their trust in leaders who are flawed and human, about the terrible consequences that can follow when desperation leads us to seek magical solutions to problems that require wisdom and courage and the willingness to face hard truths. These are heavy thoughts, perhaps, for the edge of sleep, but they need not trouble you now, for they are questions that humanity has always wrestled with and will continue to wrestle with long after this night has passed. For now, it is enough to have traveled together through this story, to have walked through the snowy villages and the golden palaces, to have glimpsed something of the complexity of one human life lived in extraordinary times, to have remembered that history is not just the grand sweep of events and movements and ideas, but also the accumulation of individual choices and encounters, of moments when one person met another and something changed, when words were spoken, or prayers were offered, or decisions were made that rippled outward in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. The Russian people, those peasants among whom Rasputin was born and who formed the vast foundation upon which the entire imperial edifice rested, endured through all the catastrophes that followed his death, through revolution and civil war and famine and terror and another world war even more devastating than the first, through decades of Soviet rule and then through the collapse of that system too. They endured because people do endure, because the capacity for survival and adaptation and hope is woven deep into human nature, because even in the darkest times there are still moments of beauty and connection and meaning that make life worth living. The wooden churches still stand in some of those villages, or have been rebuilt after being destroyed, their onion domes reaching toward the sky in that distinctive silhouette that speaks of centuries of faith and suffering and persistence. The bells still ring to call the faithful to prayer, and inside those churches, candles still flicker before icons painted in the old style, and the liturgy is still chanted in the ancient words that Rasputin would have known, that connected him to all the generations that came before and all that would come after. The forms persist even as the content changes, even as the people who perform these rituals understand them in different ways, bring to them different hopes and fears and questions. In the city of St. Petersburg, restored to its original name after the fall of communism, tourists now walk through the Winter Palace that has been transformed into the Hermitage Museum, one of the great repositories of art and culture in the world, and they marvel at the gilded halls and the priceless paintings and the glittering treasures of the Romanovs. And sometimes a guide will point out the rooms where the imperial family lived, will tell stories about Nicholas and Alexandra and their children, and will mention Rasputin, the mysterious figure who haunted these halls in the empire's final years. The palace has been preserved, turned into a monument to a lost world, a way of remembering and honoring and trying to understand what came before, what was lost, what might have been different if choices had been made differently at critical moments. But these are thoughts for daylight hours, for times when the mind is sharp and alert and ready to grapple with complexity and ambiguity. Now, in these deep hours of the night, as your breathing has perhaps grown slower and more regular, as your body has settled into comfort, and your mind has begun to release its grip on conscious thought, now is the time for simpler truths, for the recognition that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, connected to the past and to the future by threads we can barely see, but that hold us nonetheless, that give shape and meaning to our individual lives, even when we cannot fully articulate how or why. Rasputin believed, whatever else we might say about him, that there was a purpose to existence beyond the mere satisfaction of appetite or the accumulation of power or wealth, that there was a divine reality that could be touched and experienced and known, that prayer was not just empty words, but a genuine form of communication with something holy and transcendent. Whether he was right about this, whether his understanding of the divine was accurate or distorted, whether his actions lived up to his beliefs or contradicted them, these are questions that each person must answer according to their own conscience and understanding. But the yearning itself, the hunger for meaning and connection with something greater than the self, that is perhaps universal, something that speaks to the deepest parts of human nature, that manifests in different forms across cultures and centuries, but that remains recognizably the same underneath all the variations. The pilgrims still walk the roads of Russia, though fewer in number, perhaps, than in Rasputin's time, still seeking holy places, still believing that the act of walking itself can be a form of prayer, that moving through the landscape with intention and devotion can open channels of understanding that remain closed to those who stay in one place. They walk through summer heat and winter cold, through rain and snow and the brief perfection of spring and autumn, and they stop at churches and monasteries along the way, and they share stories with other pilgrims, and they carry with them the hopes and fears and prayers of people who have asked them to remember them before the icons of particular saints or at particular shrines. This tradition of pilgrimage, which was so central to Rasputin's own spiritual development, stretches back beyond Christianity to more ancient practices, the human impulse to mark certain places as sacred, to journey to those places as a way of stepping outside ordinary time and ordinary consciousness, to undergo hardship and discomfort as a way of purifying the soul and preparing it to receive whatever grace or wisdom or transformation might be available. The pilgrimage is never really about the destination, though the destination matters. It is about the journey itself, about what happens to a person in the process of walking day after day, about how the rhythm of footsteps can become a kind of meditation, about how the stripping away of comfort and routine can reveal aspects of the self that remain hidden in ordinary life. Rasputin understood this, lived it, made it central to his identity even after he had become famous and could have traveled in comfort if he had chosen to. He continued to think of himself as a pilgrim, as someone who was always in motion, always seeking, never quite settling into any permanent form or position. This restlessness, this inability to be contained by conventional boundaries, was part of his appeal and also part of his danger, for it meant that he could not be controlled or predicted, could not be relied upon to act in ways that political calculation would suggest, could not be used as a simple tool by those who thought they could manipulate him for their own purposes. The Empress Alexandra, in her letters to her husband during the war years, wrote often about Rasputin, about what he had said, about what he had advised, about her confidence that he was guided by divine wisdom and would not lead them astray. Reading these letters now, preserved in archives, available to historians and researchers, there is something deeply moving about them, despite everything we know about how the story ended. Here was a woman who was genuinely trying to do what she believed was right, who was burdened with terrible responsibilities and terrible fears, who found in this unconventional holy man a source of comfort and strength that allowed her to keep going through circumstances that would have broken many people. That her faith was misplaced, that Rasputin was not actually the divinely inspired guide she believed him to be, that her reliance on him contributed to disasters that might have been avoided. All of this is true, but it doesn't erase the human reality of her need and her searching and her desperate attempt to find solid ground in a world that was shifting beneath her feet. We might judge her harshly, and perhaps we should, for the consequences of her poor judgment were catastrophic, affecting millions of people who had no say in the decisions that shaped their fates. But we might also recognize in her story something of the universal human predicament, the way that we all must make choices based on incomplete information and limited understanding, the way that we all sometimes place our trust in people or ideas or systems that turn out to be unworthy of that trust, the way that even our best intentions and our most sincere efforts to do right can sometimes lead to terrible outcomes that we never intended and that could not have fully foreseen. The night grows deeper still, and the story circles back on itself, returning again and again to the same themes, the same images, the same questions posed in slightly different forms. This is the nature of meditation, of the kind of storytelling that is meant to quiet the mind rather than stimulate it, that is meant to create a space where thoughts can slow down and eventually stop, where the constant chatter of internal dialogue can give way to something quieter and more peaceful, where sleep can come naturally as a release from the need to analyze and judge and understand everything. In the village of Pokrovskoye, life continued after Rasputin left and even after he died, for villages are resilient things, rooted in the land and the seasons and the relationships between families who have known each other for generations. The Tura River still flows past, freezing solid in winter and rushing with snowmelt in spring, and people still draw their water from it and fish in it and cross it on their way to fields and forests. The rhythms of agricultural life, unchanged for so long, have been disrupted and altered by the events of the 20th century, by collectivization and mechanization and all the other transformations that came with modernity. But something essential remains, some connection to the land and the sky and the cycle of the seasons that persists beneath all the surface changes. The house where Rasputin was born is gone, but houses are temporary things anyway, made of wood that rots and must be replaced, shaped by the needs and resources of particular families at particular times. What matters more than the physical structure is the continuity of human presence, the fact that people still live here, still wake in the morning and work during the day, and gather around tables in the evening, still tell stories and sing songs and pass on to their children whatever wisdom and knowledge they have accumulated. Rasputin is part of that story now, the local boy who became famous, whose name is known around the world, whose life has been the subject of countless books and films and discussions. Whether the people of Pokrovskoye are proud of this or embarrassed by it, or simply indifferent, treating it as an accident of history that has little to do with their own daily concerns, varies from person to person, from generation to generation. The snow continues to fall in our imagination, covering that landscape, making everything soft and quiet, muffling sound, transforming the familiar into something mysterious and dreamlike. Snow has this quality of making the world seem both more beautiful and more dangerous, more pure in its whiteness and more threatening in its cold, more peaceful in the way it settles over everything, and more ominous in the way it can erase paths and landmarks and make it easy to lose one's way. Russia in winter is a place of extremes, where the cold can kill, but where there is also a particular kind of beauty that only exists at those temperatures, when frost creates intricate patterns on windows, when the sun, glinting off snow, creates a brightness that is almost blinding, when the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. Rasputin knew this landscape intimately, had grown up in it, had walked through it in all seasons, but perhaps especially in winter, when the act of moving from one place to another became an act of faith and endurance, when survival depended on knowledge and preparation, and a certain toughness of spirit that not everyone possessed. The peasants of Siberia were a hardy people, shaped by the demands of their environment, practical and resourceful, and accustomed to making do with whatever was available, skeptical of outsiders and fancy ideas, but capable of deep loyalty and surprising generosity to those who earned their respect. Rasputin carried these peasant qualities with him, even into the golden halls of the Winter Palace. The directness and the earthiness, and the refusal to pretend to be something other than what he was. And this authenticity, however complicated and compromised it might have been in practice, was part of what made him so compelling to people who lived in a world of masks and performance and carefully calculated presentation. In the palaces of St. Petersburg, everything was choreographed, every gesture and word carefully considered for its effect and its appropriateness according to elaborate codes of etiquette that governed interactions between people of different ranks and relationships. The imperial court was a stage where people performed their roles with the understanding that any misstep could have consequences, where the Tsar, and especially the Tsarina, were supposed to embody a kind of perfection, distant and dignified and untouchable, symbols of divine order and unchanging hierarchy. Into this artificial world came Rasputin, refusing to bow and scrape in the expected manner, speaking to emperors and grand dukes as if they were simply people, bringing with him an air of the outside world, of the vast country beyond the capital where different rules applied and different values held sway. This disruption of expected patterns was thrilling to some and horrifying to others, depending on one's perspective and interests and commitments. For those who felt stifled by convention, who sensed that something vital and authentic was being lost in all the formality and pretense, Rasputin represented a kind of liberation, proof that other ways of being were possible, that spiritual authority could exist independent of social position or formal credentials. For those who believed in the necessity and rightness of hierarchy, who saw in the elaborate structures of traditional society a reflection of divine order and a bulwark against chaos, Rasputin represented a dangerous threat, a force of disorder and corruption that was undermining the foundations on which civilization rested. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, and both were incomplete, unable to capture the full complexity of what was actually happening in Russia during those years when the old order was dying, but the shape of what would replace it was not yet clear. Rasputin was both liberator and corrupter, both authentic mystic and cynical manipulator, both victim and villain, and the fact that he could be all these things simultaneously, that he contained within himself contradictions that could not be easily resolved or explained, is perhaps what has kept his story alive and compelling for more than a century since his death. As your consciousness drifts, as the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes thinner and more permeable, as the details of the story begin to fade, and only the broad outlines and the general mood remain. You might find yourself thinking not about the specific facts and events, but about something more elemental, about the mystery of human personality and human choice, about how we are all mixtures of light and shadow, nobility and baseness, wisdom and folly, about how the same person can be capable of genuine kindness and callous cruelty, of profound insight and staggering blindness, of sincere devotion and transparent selfishness. Rasputin's life invites us to extend this recognition not just to him, but to ourselves and to all the people we encounter, to resist the temptation to reduce anyone to a simple category of good or bad, hero or villain, to acknowledge instead the irreducible complexity of human nature, the way that we are all works in progress, all stumbling forward through lives that we only partly understand, all making the best choices we can with the information and understanding we have available, all capable of growth and change and transformation, but also of regression and repetition and the persistent making of the same mistakes in slightly different forms. The church bells ring in the distance, marking hours that pass, whether we are awake or asleep to notice them, dividing time into manageable units, providing structure and rhythm to days that might otherwise blur together into an undifferentiated flow. In Russia, the sound of church bells has always been part of the soundscape, the acoustic background against which life unfolds, calling people to prayer, marking celebrations and sorrows, reminding everyone of the presence of the sacred even in the midst of ordinary concerns. Rasputin would have grown up with this sound, would have heard it every day, would have learned to orient himself in time and space, partly through the pattern of bells marking different hours and different liturgical occasions. These bells still ring in Moscow and St. Petersburg and in villages throughout the vast Russian landscape, maintaining a connection to the past even as everything else changes, even as political systems rise and fall, even as the external forms of life are transformed by technology and economics and social upheaval. The sound of a church bell is a kind of anchor, something that reaches back through centuries, that connects the present moment to all the moments that came before, that reminds us that we are part of a story much longer than our individual lives, that our brief passage through this world is given meaning partly by its connection to what came before and what will come after. Rasputin's passage through this world was brief, just 47 years from birth to death, less than half a century in which to live and love and make his mark and meet his end. But those years coincided with one of the most dramatic periods in Russian history, perhaps in world history, when empires that had seemed eternal were revealed to be fragile and temporary, when social orders that had been taken for granted were overturned, when millions of people who had lived as peasants and subjects began to imagine themselves as citizens and workers with rights and dignity and the power to shape their own destinies. Rasputin was not the cause of these transformations, could not have prevented them or significantly altered their course, but he was caught up in them, became a symbol of them, lived and died in ways that came to represent something larger than his individual story. The water of the Neva River flows on, indifferent to human dramas, moving according to laws of gravity and geology that operated long before there were people to observe them, and will continue long after we are gone. On that December night in 1916, the river received Rasputin's body into its dark embrace, its icy waters closing over him, beginning the process of returning him to the elements from which all life is formed and to which all life returns. Water is like that, both giver and taker of life, essential and dangerous, nurturing and destroying, flowing always from higher ground to lower, seeking the path of least resistance, wearing away stone given enough time, capable of existing in multiple forms, solid and liquid and vapor, transforming back and forth between these states according to temperature and pressure and other conditions beyond human control. Russians have always had a complicated relationship with water, depending on their great rivers for transportation and trade and sustenance, but also fearing the floods that could destroy whole villages, aware of the drownings that claimed lives every year, knowing that winter ice that seemed solid could suddenly give way and plunge the unwary into freezing water from which there was often no rescue. Rasputin himself, according to some accounts, had premonitions about water, dreams or visions that suggested he would meet his end in that element, though whether these accounts are reliable or whether they were invented or embellished after the fact is impossible to say with certainty. The difficulty of knowing what really happened, of separating fact from fiction, truth from propaganda, is one of the challenges in telling Rasputin's story, and indeed in understanding any historical figure who became controversial and mythologized during their lifetime. The sources we have are often unreliable, written by people with agendas and biases, shaped by the political and social contexts in which they were produced, contradicting each other in significant ways, leaving us with puzzles and ambiguities that cannot be definitively resolved. Historians do their best to sift through these sources, to evaluate them critically, to construct narratives that are as accurate as possible given the available evidence, but there always remains a level of uncertainty, a recognition that our knowledge is partial and provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerges or as new interpretative frameworks suggest different ways of understanding the same facts. This uncertainty need not trouble us now, for we are not historians attempting to establish definitive truth, but simply companions sharing a story on a quiet night, acknowledging that the past is a foreign country that we can visit only through imagination and the traces that have been left behind. That every act of historical understanding is also an act of creation, of shaping raw material into narrative form, of finding patterns and meanings that may or may not have been apparent to the people who lived through the events themselves. We do the best we can. We tell the stories as truthfully as we know how, and we recognize that other storytellers might emphasize different details, might draw different conclusions, might create different narratives from the same basic events. The icon of the Madonna and Child that Rasputin prayed before, in churches and chapels and private rooms throughout his life, gazes out at us across the centuries, with eyes that seem to hold both sorrow and compassion, understanding and forgiveness. These icons, painted according to traditional forms that had been established centuries ago, were not meant to be realistic portraits, but rather windows into the divine realm, images that could serve as focal points for prayer and meditation, presences that made the sacred tangible and accessible. Rasputin's devotion to these icons was genuine and deep, part of the bedrock of his faith that persisted through all his wanderings and his involvement in politics and his various scandals and controversies. He would stand before an icon and pray for hours, or so witnesses reported, his lips moving continuously in the repetition of the Jesus prayer, his body swaying slightly, his entire being focused on the act of prayer with an intensity that was almost frightening to observe. This capacity for spiritual concentration, for shutting out everything else and entering into a state of communion with the divine, was perhaps his most genuine spiritual gift, the foundation of whatever healing power or spiritual authority he possessed. It was not a trick or a pretense, but something real, a discipline that he had developed over years of practice, a way of accessing deeper levels of consciousness and mobilizing energies that most people never touch in their ordinary, busy, distracted lives. Modern psychology might explain this in terms of altered states of consciousness, the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, the power of focused attention and belief to affect both mental and physical states. But such explanations, while valuable, do not quite capture the lived experience of prayer, the sense that one is actually making contact with something beyond the self, that the words and the gestures and the focused attention are opening channels through which grace can flow, through which healing and wisdom and strength can be received from a source that transcends the individual ego. Whether we interpret this source as God, or as the deeper self, or as some other aspect of reality that science has not yet fully mapped, the experiential reality remains the same, and for Rasputin and for those who believed in him, that experiential reality was what mattered most. The Empress Alexandra, kneeling in her private chapel or standing before the icons in her rooms, would have engaged in similar acts of prayer, seeking in the divine presence comfort and guidance and the strength to continue bearing the burdens that her position placed upon her. She and Rasputin met, in some sense, in that space of prayer, in that shared conviction that the material world wasn't all there was, that human extremity could be met by divine intervention, that faith was not just a consoling illusion, but an active force that could change outcomes and heal wounds and provide wisdom that mere human understanding could not access. The tragedy was not that they believed these things, for such beliefs are ancient and widespread and have brought comfort and meaning to countless millions across cultures and centuries, but that their particular form of belief blinded them to other realities that also needed to be acknowledged and addressed, political and social and economic realities that would not yield to prayer alone, that required different kinds of wisdom and different kinds of action. As the night reaches its deepest point, that hour when sleep is most profound and dreams are most vivid, when the body's metabolic processes slow to their lowest ebb and consciousness withdraws from engagement with the external world to focus on internal processes of restoration and integration. As we reach this point in our journey together through Rasputin's story and through this long night, perhaps it is time to begin gathering the threads, to start moving toward closure, toward the gentle release into sleep that has been our destination all along. We have traveled far together, from a small Siberian village where a child was born to peasant parents, through years of spiritual seeking and wandering across the vast Russian landscape into the golden halls of imperial power, where a peasant became confidant to emperors through scandal and controversy and war and revolution, finally to a winter night when conspirators decided that one man's death might somehow save an empire that was already beyond saving. We have seen the snowy fields and the wooden churches, the candle-lit monasteries and the glittering ballrooms, the faces of devotees and enemies, believers and skeptics, the powerful and the powerless, all drawn into the orbit of this one extraordinary life. What remains now is simply to let go, to release our hold on the story and allow it to recede into the past where it belongs, to acknowledge that Rasputin's time has passed, that the world he inhabited is gone, that the questions his life raised are our questions now to wrestle with or to set aside as we see fit. His bones are dust, scattered somewhere in the soil around what was once St. Petersburg, mixed now with the earth that has received countless others before and since, returning to the great cycle of matter and energy that sustains all life on this planet. His name persists, inscribed in books and databases, and in the neural patterns of people who have heard his story. But the man himself, the living, breathing consciousness that was Grigori Rasputin, that is gone, dissolved back into whatever mystery we emerge from at birth and return to at death. And yet something remains, some quality or essence that transcends the specific historical details, some recognition of the complexity of human nature and human circumstance, some understanding that we are all participants in dramas larger than ourselves, that our choices matter even though their consequences are unpredictable, that the search for meaning and purpose and connection is not foolish or misguided, but deeply human and deeply necessary. Whatever form that search might take, however imperfectly we might pursue it. Rest now, dear traveller, through this long night's story. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your muscles relax completely. Let your thoughts become quieter and less distinct, drifting like snow falling in darkness, each thought a unique crystalline form that appears for a moment and then melts into the general softness that surrounds you. The story is complete, the journey is over, and there is nothing more you need to do now except allow yourself to sink into sleep, natural and easy, letting go of everything, trusting in the darkness and the quiet and the restoration that sleep brings. The candles in the church grow dim, their flames guttering as the wax is consumed, casting dancing shadows on the walls where icons hang in their appointed places, watching over the empty pews with patient stillness. Outside, the snow continues falling, covering the paths and the rooftops, covering the places where people walked and worked and prayed, making everything clean and new, preparing the world for morning, though morning is still hours away. In this moment, between darkness and light, between waking and sleeping, between the story that has been told and the silence that follows, there is peace, there is stillness, there is the gentle recognition that you are safe and warm, and that sleep is very near now, waiting to receive you like an old friend, like a homecoming, like the ending that every story must have. Thank you for traveling with me through this long night, through Rasputin's remarkable life, and through the world of imperial Russia that shaped him and was shaped by him. Thank you for your patience and your attention and your willingness to journey into the past and to consider the complexities of a life that defies easy categorization or simple judgment. May you rest well. May your dreams be peaceful. May you wake refreshed and ready for whatever the new day brings. The sleepy historian bids you good night and wishes you the deepest and most restorative sleep, where your mind and body can do the work of healing and integration that happens only in these quiet hours, when consciousness releases its grip and allows deeper processes to unfold. Sleep now. The story is finished. The night embraces you. All is well. Good night.